Daniel lived in a small house by the edge of a calm and beautiful lake. Every morning, he would wake up early, open his wooden window, and let the cool breeze brush across his face. The sound of birds filled the air, and the reflection of the rising sun painted the water with shades of gold and silver. To Daniel, the lake was not just a view outside his home, it was a piece of his heart. His boat, a simple wooden one he had built with his father many years ago, rested gently by the dock. It was not fancy or expensive. It was plain, yet strong, and it carried memories in every nail and every piece of wood. Whenever Daniel looked at it, he remembered long summer days spent fishing with his father, laughter echoing across the water, and quiet evenings rowing under the stars. Most of the new families in the neighborhood only saw the lake as scenery. They admired it, took pictures, and enjoyed its calm presence. But they did not know what Daniel knew. They did not know that the lake belonged to him. Long before the houses, the gardens, and the freshly painted fences were built, Daniel's family had lived there. The land and the water were part of an old inheritance, carefully passed down, written in papers kept safe in a wooden box. For Daniel, life by the lake was peaceful. He lived alone, but he never felt lonely. The lake spoke to him in ripples, in waves, in gentle winds. Sometimes, he would sit for hours on the dock, reading a book or just staring into the endless blue surface. Neighbors often passed by and waved, and though Daniel was friendly, he mostly kept to himself. He was not the type to argue or cause trouble. He believed that nature gave enough lessons if one listened. But life began to change when the new homeowners association, known as the HOA, grew stronger in the neighborhood. At first, they were harmless. They organized small events, sent newsletters, and talked about keeping the community clean and beautiful. Daniel paid little attention to them, since he thought their rules applied only to shared streets and gardens, not to his private dock or lake. He had no reason to think otherwise. One quiet afternoon, as Daniel was fixing the rope on his boat, he noticed a few people from the HOA standing on the other side of the street. They were pointing toward his dock, whispering to one another, and writing something down in a notebook. Daniel raised a hand to wave, but they did not wave back. They simply turned and walked away. He thought little of it at the time. The following morning, Daniel found a folded letter taped neatly to his front door. The paper was crisp, the handwriting formal, and the words carefully chosen. It was from the HOA. The letter began with polite greetings but soon turned into a firm demand. Daniel was asked to remove his boat from the lake. According to the letter, his boat was disturbing the calm surface of the water by creating unnecessary ripples. Daniel read the letter twice, then sat down on his porch, holding it in his hands. For a moment, he thought it was a joke. A boat creating ripples was as natural as the wind moving the trees. Lakes were meant to ripple, to move, to reflect life itself. He shook his head slowly and let out a quiet laugh. Surely, this was just a misunderstanding. But the tone of the letter was serious. It gave him a deadline and even warned him of possible community fines if he failed to act. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it on his table. He did not feel angry, but he did feel puzzled. How could anyone believe they had the right to tell him what to do with his boat on his own lake? That evening, Daniel made himself a cup of tea and sat on the dock, watching the sun sink into the horizon. His boat floated quietly beside him, as though listening. The water was calm, carrying soft ripples that shimmered in the fading light. Daniel thought about his father's words long ago, "The lake is part of you, and you are part of it. Never forget that." The neighborhood was new, the people were unfamiliar, and the rules were strange. But Daniel knew one thing with certainty: the lake had been his before the HOA ever existed. Still, he decided to remain calm. Perhaps a simple conversation could clear everything up. Perhaps they did not know. But deep in his heart, Daniel felt a small shadow of worry. He wondered if this was only the beginning of something bigger, something that might disturb the peace he had cherished for so long. For now, though, the night was still, and the stars began to appear above the lake. Daniel rested his hand on the edge of the boat and whispered softly, "Don't worry. You're not going anywhere." The next few days passed quietly, but Daniel could not forget the letter from the HOA. He had placed it on his small wooden table, and every time he walked past it, his eyes fell on the bold words, "Remove your boat." The more he read it, the stranger it seemed. A boat, tied to a dock, resting gently on water, was now being treated as a problem. Daniel tried not to let it disturb his peace. He went on with his daily routine, watering his small garden, reading in the evenings, and taking short rows across the lake when the weather was clear. Yet, deep inside, the letter stayed like a small pebble in his shoe, something he could not quite ignore. One morning, as Daniel was rowing slowly across the lake, he noticed a group of neighbors standing near the shore. They were talking in low voices, pointing toward his boat as it moved across the water. He could hear bits of their conversation carried by the breeze, against the rules, making ripples, looks untidy. Daniel shook his head gently. Ripples were not untidy, they were natural, a sign that the lake was alive. Without movement, water would grow still and unhealthy. But he said nothing. He was not the kind of man to raise his voice unless it was truly necessary. Later that afternoon, Daniel received a second letter, this one even firmer than the first. It repeated the demand and added a line that caught Daniel's attention: "The lake is part of the community, and all residents must follow the same rules to maintain order." Daniel's calm expression did not change, but in his heart, he knew the letter was wrong. The lake was not part of the community. It belonged to him. His family had owned it for generations, long before any houses or streets had been built. The HOA might not know, or perhaps they assumed ownership without checking. Either way, Daniel realized this was not a simple misunderstanding anymore. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch with a notebook. He began writing down details he remembered about the property: the year his father showed him the deed, the boundaries that marked the land and water, the old box where the documents were kept. He decided he would need to look through the papers soon, just to be ready. The next weekend brought more tension. As Daniel was sweeping the leaves off his dock, he saw 3 people approaching. They were members of the HOA board, dressed neatly, carrying clipboards. The one in front, a tall man named Greg, cleared his throat and spoke with authority. "Good morning," Greg said. "We need to speak with you about your boat." Daniel set the broom aside and nodded politely. "Of course. What seems to be the issue?" Greg exchanged a quick look with the others before continuing. "The boat must be removed. It is not allowed under community rules. It disturbs the calm water and creates ripples. Many neighbors have complained." Daniel listened patiently, then asked a simple question. "Can you show me where in your rules it says I cannot keep my boat on my lake?" The woman standing next to Greg adjusted her glasses. "The rules apply to all community property, including the lake." Daniel's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I understand, but this lake is not community property. It belongs to me." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Greg frowned, clearly surprised by Daniel's words. "That's not possible," he said firmly. The lake is part of the neighborhood. It has always been considered shared. Daniel gave a small smile. Considered shared, perhaps. But ownership is different. I have the documents that show otherwise. The HOA members shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting quick compliance, not resistance. Greg straightened his papers and spoke again. Well, until we see proof, you are still expected to follow the rules. Please remove the boat within 7 days, or the board will issue fines. Daniel nodded calmly. I hear what you're saying. But I will not be moving my boat. Thank you for visiting. With that, he turned back to his dock work, leaving the three of them standing awkwardly. That night, Daniel lit a small lamp and opened the wooden box where he kept his family documents. The old papers smelled of time and history. Carefully, he unfolded the deed, the map, and the signatures that marked ownership of the land and lake. His father's words echoed in his memory, "These papers are more than ink. They are the truth of what belongs to us." As he read through the documents, Daniel felt a quiet strength rising within him. He had always chosen peace over conflict, but he understood something important now. Sometimes, protecting peace meant standing firm. The moonlight shone through his window, lighting up the old deed spread out on the table. Daniel placed his hand gently on the paper and whispered to himself, "The lake is ours. It always has been." Outside, the boat rocked softly against the dock, sending ripples across the water, natural, gentle, and endless, just like the truth Daniel carried in his hands. The morning sun rose gently over the lake, casting a golden glow on the water. Daniel stood on his dock, tying the rope of his boat, when he heard footsteps approaching. The sound was sharp and deliberate, not like the quiet steps of a neighbor out for a walk. He turned and saw three familiar faces from the Homeowners Association: Greg, the tall man with a serious look, Susan, the woman with glasses, and Mark, a younger board member holding a clipboard. They walked together, their expressions firm, as if they had already decided the outcome of this meeting. Daniel greeted them with a calm smile. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice steady like the water around him. Greg cleared his throat and spoke first. "Mr. Daniel, we gave you a notice last week, and the deadline is today. The boat must be removed immediately. It disturbs the calm of the community lake." Daniel leaned against one of the wooden posts of his dock. His hands were relaxed, but his eyes showed patience mixed with quiet strength. "I understand what your letter said," he replied. "But I told you before, this is not a community lake. It belongs to me. The boat will not be moved." Susan adjusted her glasses and stepped forward. "With respect, Mr. Daniel, many neighbors have complained. They say the ripples from your boat are distracting. They want the water to stay still, like glass. That is the beauty of this place." Daniel gave a gentle laugh, not mocking but genuine. "Water is not glass. It moves. It breathes. Ripples are part of its life. Without movement, it becomes unhealthy." Mark, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Even if what you say is true, the rules must be followed. Everyone in this community agreed to live under the same guidelines." He looked down at his clipboard as if the words written there could give him courage. Daniel's calm tone did not change. "Guidelines are for community property. The streets, the gardens, the fences, those are yours to manage. But this dock and this lake are mine. They have been mine since long before this neighborhood existed." Greg crossed his arms, his voice growing sharper. "That's a bold claim. If it were true, the HOA would have known about it. You cannot expect us to believe that you own a whole lake. Daniel straightened slightly but kept his voice soft. I don't expect you to believe my words alone. I have the documents. I can show you the deed anytime. The land, the dock, and the lake are clearly marked as private property. The three board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their confident arrival had turned into hesitation. Susan opened her mouth to speak, but Greg lifted his hand to stop her. Proof or not, you are still causing disruption. Until this is cleared, the boat must go. Daniel looked at them, his expression steady as stone. No. The boat will stay. You may not step on my dock again without permission. And you may not tell me what to do with what is mine. There was a silence. The soft sound of water lapping against the dock filled the air. Birds flew overhead, their wings casting brief shadows on the lake's surface. The moment was calm, yet filled with unspoken weight. Finally, Greg spoke again, though his voice was less firm than before. Then we will take this matter further. You will hear from us soon. He turned, signaling the others to follow. They walked away, their clipboards and papers rustling in the breeze, but their steps were slower than before. Daniel watched them go, then looked back at his boat. It rocked gently, its reflection broken into ripples that spread across the lake. He placed a hand on its side, as though reassuring an old friend. We're not moving, he whispered. That evening, Daniel sat at his table with the old wooden box open before him. The deed lay on top, its ink faded but clear. He traced his finger along the map where the boundaries were drawn. Every line told a story of his family's connection to this place. He remembered his father's voice, one day, people may forget what belongs to us. But you must not forget. These papers are your shield. As the lamp flickered beside him, Daniel thought about what had happened at the dock. The HOA had come with authority, but authority without truth was like an empty shell. He knew this was not the end. They would return, perhaps with stronger words, perhaps with more pressure. But Daniel also knew he had something stronger than their rules. He had the truth. Outside, the lake shimmered under the silver light of the moon. The boat floated peacefully, tied securely, as though it trusted Daniel to protect it. The ripples spread slowly, catching the moonlight like tiny stars across the water. Daniel closed the box, locked it carefully, and placed it back in its corner. His heart was calm, but his mind was clear. The coming days would bring more challenges, but he was ready. For Daniel, the lake was more than property. It was memory, history, and life itself. And no board, no letter, no rule could take that away from him. The days following the confrontation at the dock were unusually quiet, yet Daniel could feel the air shift in the neighborhood. When he went for walks around the lake, some neighbors greeted him warmly, while others gave him quick, questioning glances. The whispers had spread. People were talking about the man who claimed to own the lake. Daniel did not let it trouble him. He had lived beside this water long before the houses were built, and he knew the truth. Still, the HOA's persistence worried him. They were not the type to give up easily. He needed to be prepared for whatever steps they might take next. One evening, as the golden light of sunset spilled across the lake, Daniel sat inside his small study. On the floor beside him was the old wooden box he had carried since his father's passing. The box was not large, but it carried weight of history, responsibility, and truth. Daniel carefully lifted the lid and removed the documents inside. Some were folded maps, their edges soft from years of use. Others were legal papers, stamped and signed by people who were long gone. He laid them across the table, one by one, creating a story that stretched back generations. At the very center lay the most important document, the deed. Its paper was yellowed with age, but the ink still spoke clearly. Daniel traced the words with his finger, whispering them as though reading aloud to the lake itself. Ownership of the land, dock, and lake. His heart settled as he read. These were not just words on paper. They were proof. But Daniel knew proof meant little if he did not organize it properly. The HOA would not simply accept his word or even one old paper. They would want everything clear, official, and undeniable. Over the next few days, Daniel dedicated himself to careful research. He visited the town records office, carrying a small folder under his arm. The office was quiet, filled with the smell of paper and the soft hum of ceiling fans. The clerk, a kind woman named Linda, greeted him with a smile. "How can I help you today, Mr. Daniel?" she asked. Daniel explained his situation briefly. He did not speak harshly about the HOA, he only said there was some confusion about the lake and he wanted to confirm the ownership. Linda listened patiently and then disappeared into the back room. After some time, she returned carrying a thick book of records and a stack of photocopies. "This should help you," she said warmly. "Everything here shows the transfer of ownership from your grandfather to your father, and then to you. The lake has always been private property." Daniel thanked her, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He placed the copies neatly into his folder and returned home. That night, he spread them out on the table beside the original deed. Together, they formed a complete picture, a strong shield against any false claims. As he worked, memories of his childhood floated back. He remembered running along the shore, his father teaching him how to row, his mother setting a picnic blanket under the old oak tree by the water. The lake was not just property, it was life, laughter, and family. Protecting it now felt like honoring all those moments that had shaped him. The following morning, Daniel prepared a second folder, this one with organized copies of the deed, maps, and official town records. He labeled each page carefully, as though he were building a story for someone else to read. He wanted everything to be clear, undeniable, and simple to understand. Later that week, Daniel noticed another HOA letter tucked under his door. This one was longer, more formal, filled with official language. It mentioned possible penalties for non-compliance and legal steps if necessary. Daniel read it calmly, then placed it beside the first two letters. He did not feel fear. Instead, he felt ready. The sun was setting when he walked out to the dock with his folder in hand. The boat rocked gently, and the lake shimmered with soft ripples. Daniel sat down on the edge of the dock and let the folder rest on his lap. He looked out at the horizon and spoke softly, as though his father could still hear him. "They think they can push me," he said quietly. "But they don't know the truth. And the truth is stronger than their rules." The water responded in its own way, sending a wave against the dock that rocked the boat. Daniel smiled. He felt no anger, no bitterness. Only determination. The coming days would bring another meeting, another confrontation. The HOA believed they had power, but Daniel knew the foundation of their claims was thin. He held something stronger than rules. He held history, memory, and proof written in ink. As the stars appeared one by one above the lake, Daniel placed the folder back under his arm. He rose from the dock, his step slow but steady. He was ready to face whatever came next. The lake would remain his, just as it had always been. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt a calm certainty: truth, like water, may ripple, but it never disappears. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived with heavy clouds above the lake. Daniel woke early, not from an alarm, but from the quiet weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He moved slowly through his routine, watering his garden, preparing a simple breakfast, and sitting for a moment on the dock with his boat. The lake was calm, but Daniel could feel the storm of words waiting for him that evening. Inside his study, the folder of documents rested on the table. The deed, the maps, and the town records were all carefully organized, each page a shield of truth. Daniel slid the papers into a larger leather case, making sure everything was in order. He did not want to walk into the meeting with anger or pride. He wanted to walk in with calm confidence. By the time evening came, the small community hall was filled with people. Chairs were lined up in neat rows, and neighbors sat whispering to one another, their voices like the low buzz of bees. Some looked curious, some looked uncertain, and a few already looked impatient. At the front of the room, the HOA board members sat behind a long table, their clipboards and papers stacked neatly in front of them. Daniel entered quietly, carrying his case under one arm. A few neighbors nodded politely, while others avoided his eyes. He found an empty chair near the middle and sat down. The air felt heavy with expectation. Greg, the tall man with a firm voice, stood up and tapped his papers against the table. "We will begin tonight's meeting," he announced. "There are several matters to discuss, but first, we must address an important issue concerning the lake." A murmur ran through the room. People leaned forward in their chairs. All eyes turned toward Daniel. Greg cleared his throat. "As you know, one resident has refused to follow community rules regarding the use of the lake. Despite repeated requests, his boat remains tied to the dock, disturbing the calm surface. This is a violation, and action must be taken." Daniel remained still, his hands resting on his case. He did not interrupt. He wanted them to speak fully before he responded. Susan adjusted her glasses and added, "We have received many complaints. Residents expect a peaceful environment, free from disturbances. The board has the responsibility to protect that peace. If rules are ignored, the order of our community will break down." The room was quiet, waiting. Finally, Greg looked toward Daniel. "Do you have anything to say before the board decides the next steps?" Daniel rose slowly from his chair. He carried the case to the front and placed it gently on the table. His calm presence seemed to fill the room. For a moment, no one spoke. "Yes," Daniel said softly, his voice steady but clear. "I do have something to say." He opened the case and pulled out the first document, the deed. Holding it carefully, he laid it on the table for all to see. "This is the original deed to the property. It was passed from my grandfather to my father, and then to me. It clearly states ownership of the land, the dock, and the lake." A quiet gasp spread through the room. Neighbors leaned closer, trying to read the paper from their seats. Daniel then pulled out the copies from the town office. "These are records from the local government, confirming the same. The lake has never been community property. It has always been private." The silence deepened. Even Greg, who usually spoke with such confidence, seemed at a loss for words. He glanced at Susan, then at Mark, but neither of them moved. Daniel continued, his tone gentle but firm. "I respect this community. I respect the efforts to keep it clean and organized. But the HOA has no authority over my lake. My boat is not breaking any rule, because your rules do not reach here." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a neighbor from the back raised his hand. "So the lake doesn't belong to all of us?" he asked carefully. Daniel turned to face him. "No. It belongs to me and my family. but I have never stopped anyone from enjoying its view. I have never closed it off. I only ask for respect, the same respect I give to all of you." A quiet discussion broke out among the neighbors. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others whispered in surprise. The mood in the room had shifted. Greg finally stood again, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "We will need time to review these documents," he said slowly. "But if what you say is true, then perhaps, we may have misunderstood." Daniel gave a small nod. "I am not here to fight. I only want peace. But peace cannot be built on false claims. The truth must be recognized." He gathered his papers, closed the case, and returned to his seat. The room buzzed with low voices, but Daniel felt calm. He had spoken his truth, and he had shown his proof. Whether the board liked it or not, the facts could not be erased. As the meeting moved on to other topics, Daniel looked out the window at the lake beyond. The water shimmered faintly under the evening sky, rippling gently as if listening. For Daniel, the meeting was not about winning or losing. It was about standing firm, about protecting something that had always been his. And as he sat quietly, he knew the HOA's authority had just cracked like thin ice under the weight of truth. The days after the HOA meeting felt different in the neighborhood. Whispers followed Daniel whenever he walked by. Some neighbors smiled at him with respect, while others looked uncertain, still trying to understand the truth about the lake. The HOA board, however, remained unusually quiet. No more letters appeared on Daniel's door. No more complaints echoed across the street. But Daniel knew silence was not the same as acceptance. The board had not apologized, and they had not admitted their mistake. They were waiting, perhaps hoping Daniel would grow tired or back down. Yet Daniel was not the kind of man to step away from the truth. One afternoon, as Daniel sat on his porch reading, he noticed movement near his dock. At first, he thought it was just a group of children passing by, but as he looked closer, his expression changed. It was Greg and two other board members, standing boldly on his dock, pointing toward his boat as though measuring something. They had papers in their hands, scribbling notes without hesitation. Daniel set his book down and walked calmly toward them. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden boards made the three turn, but they did not step back. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but firm. Greg lifted his chin. "We're conducting an inspection. The board must review all possible violations. This dock is part of our review." Daniel's eyes softened, though his tone grew sharper. "This dock is mine. You are standing on private property without permission. You know this now. I showed you the documents at the meeting." Susan, who stood beside Greg, adjusted her glasses nervously. "We only need to be thorough, Mr. Daniel. It's for the good of the community." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. This is trespassing. You had no right to walk onto my dock. You had no right to touch what belongs to me." The three exchanged uneasy glances, but Greg tried to hold his ground. "We are simply doing our duty. You cannot stop the board from checking community areas." Daniel's calm voice carried strength like a rising tide. "And I told you before, this is not community land. This is private property. If you step here again without my permission, I will take action." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving them in stunned silence. For the first time, it was not Daniel who looked unsettled, it was them. That evening, Daniel sat at his table, papers spread neatly in front of him. The idea had been forming in his mind since the meeting, but now it stood clear. The HOA had not only been wrong, they had crossed a line. By stepping onto his dock without permission, they had trespassed. And trespassing had consequences. He wrote a letter that night, careful with every word. It was polite, but it carried the weight of truth. To the HOA board, the letter began, "This is to inform you that members of the board entered my private property without permission on date. This act is trespassing. As the legal owner of the lake and dock, I am issuing a fine for this violation. Please consider this an official notice. Future unauthorized entry will result in legal action." Daniel signed it and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, he walked calmly to the HOA office and handed it to the receptionist. The effect was immediate. By evening, neighbors were talking. Some were surprised, others amused, but many admired Daniel's calm courage. For years, the HOA had been the authority, handing out notices and fines. Now, for the first time, the tables had turned. At the next board gathering, Greg's usual strong voice seemed weaker. He read Daniel's letter aloud, his face tight with frustration. Some neighbors even chuckled quietly at the idea of the HOA being fined. Susan looked down at her notes, and Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel, sitting calmly in the audience, spoke when the moment came. "I did not want this," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "But respect is a two-way path. You cannot demand it if you do not give it. You stepped onto my land without asking, and that has consequences." The room was silent, filled with the sound of his words sinking deep. Neighbors looked between Daniel and the board, realizing the truth was no longer hidden. That night, as Daniel walked back to his house, the lake shimmered under the stars. His boat rocked gently, as if proud of its owner's strength. Daniel stood on the dock, looking out at the water, and whispered softly, "Peace is not weakness. Peace is knowing when to stand firm." The ripples spread slowly, catching the moonlight. Daniel knew the struggle was not over, but something important had shifted. The HOA had tried to control him, but now they had tasted the weight of their own mistakes. For the first time, Daniel felt not just calm, but free. The sun rose slowly over the lake, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Daniel stood on the dock, feeling the cool morning breeze brush against his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced since the letters from the HOA began arriving. The boat, his faithful companion, floated gently beside him, its reflection rippling softly in the calm water. The events of the past weeks had changed the neighborhood in subtle but profound ways. Neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now nodded politely, offering small smiles when Daniel passed by. Some stopped to ask him questions about the lake, curious but respectful. The news of the HOA being fined for trespassing had spread quietly, creating a mixture of amusement and admiration in the community. Daniel had not acted out of anger or pride. He had acted to protect what was rightfully his, to honor the memory of his family, and to preserve the peace of the place he loved. The letters, the confrontations, the late nights of research, all of it had been difficult, but it had also reminded him of the strength that comes from knowing the truth and standing firm. That morning, he noticed a small boat approaching from the far side of the lake. A neighbor, an elderly man named Thomas, waved and smiled. He had always been friendly but cautious, unsure of how the lake was governed. Now, with clarity restored, Thomas wanted to share a moment of gratitude. "Good morning, Daniel," Thomas called as he reached the dock. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up for what is right. For showing us that calm strength matters more than loud arguments." Daniel smiled warmly. "Thank you, Thomas. "I only want the lake to be peaceful for everyone to enjoy, without misunderstanding or conflict." They shared a quiet moment, watching the sun climb higher. The lake shimmered beneath the light, ripples spreading slowly, reflecting the sky above. Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the water was safe, his property respected, and the balance restored. The HOA had learned a lesson, though Daniel hoped they had learned more than just rules about trespassing. Respect, he knew, could not be demanded, it had to be earned. Authority without fairness was empty. By showing calm courage, he had not only protected his home but also reminded the neighborhood of a simple truth: honesty, patience, and steadfastness could shape outcomes more powerfully than confrontation or anger. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to a steady rhythm. Daniel spent mornings on the dock, rowing his boat gently across the lake, listening to the whispers of the wind and the gentle lap of water against the shore. Evenings were for quiet reflection, watching the colors of sunset mirror across the water. The lake, always alive, seemed to respond to his presence. It was as if the water itself understood the peace that had been restored. Neighbors began to approach him differently. Children, who once stayed away, now asked politely if they could watch him row or help tie the ropes. Families stopped to admire the sunset, chatting with him about the natural beauty rather than rules and regulations. The lake became a shared space, not by force of authority, but by mutual respect and understanding. Daniel thought often of his father, of the lessons he had learned as a child sitting on the dock, listening to stories about the land and water. "One day, people may forget," his father had said, "but the truth and care you carry will guide you." Those words had guided him through the letters, the confrontations, and the silent battles. Now, they resonated with quiet satisfaction. One evening, as the first stars appeared above the lake, Daniel sat at the dock, the water glowing softly under the fading light. The boat rocked gently, the ripples spreading calmly across the surface. He closed his eyes and let the cool breeze carry away the tension that had held him for weeks. Peace was no longer just a word, it was a feeling, alive in every wave, every star, every soft whisper of wind through the trees. Even the HOA, distant and quiet, seemed to have accepted the truth without further confrontation. They no longer sent letters, and the tension in the neighborhood gradually melted away. Daniel understood that his actions had not only protected his property but also reminded others of the importance of fairness, respect, and patience. As night settled over the lake, Daniel stood and looked at the horizon, the water stretching endlessly before him. He placed a hand on the boat, his fingers tracing the familiar wood. "We are home," he whispered softly. The boat rocked gently, as if agreeing, sending ripples that danced across the moonlit water. In that moment, Daniel felt the full circle of peace restored. The lake was still his, the memories of the past honored, and the quiet joy of life beside the water remained untouched by misunderstanding or conflict. It was a gentle, steady triumph, one built not on anger or pride, but on truth, patience, and unwavering calm. The neighborhood had changed, the HOA had learned, and Daniel had found a deeper connection to the lake than ever before. The sun would rise again tomorrow, the water would ripple under his touch, and life would continue in quiet, unshakable harmony. And Daniel, standing on his dock beneath the stars, knew one simple truth: sometimes the strongest power comes from calmness, and the deepest peace comes from knowing that you have stood firmly for what is right. The boat floated gently, the lake shimmered, and all was as it should be.